welcome to another episode of District of Sports. I'm George Gerbo. A reminder that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts, including on Apple, Google, Spotify, TuneIn, and more. Just search District of Sports in your favorite podcast app. And to find all of our sports coverage at the Washington Times at washingtontimes.com/sports and on social media at WashTimesSports. It is rivalry week in college football, and that includes a local matchup that area fans haven't seen for a long time. Maryland and Virginia, UVA and UMD, the Terps and the Who's meet Friday night for the 79th time and first in a decade. The neighboring state schools met annually as members of the Atlantic Coast Conference from 1957 to 2013, which was Maryland's final season in the ACC before moving to the Big Ten. As we're seeing in the latest rounds of college conference realignment, many of these historic matchups can end up falling by the wayside. With that, it can be hard to relate the hostilities of the past to today's generation of players, many of whom are too young to remember the glory days and haven't played in these types of games. But for both Maryland and Virginia, the game still holds an importance, especially among fans and alumni in the region. And joining me to break down the renewal of the border war, the renewal of Maryland and Virginia, from the Charlottesville Daily Progress, Virginia beat writer Greg Medea. Greg, good to see you.
George, good to see you too. Always nice to reconnect with some fellow West Virginia, alum.
Absolutely. In the interest of full disclosure, Greg and I both crossed paths during our time at WVU, worked at the student radio station. So we've got, and it's perfect setup because we've got, I think, a good handle on rivalries. Pitt and West Virginia playing in their rivalry last year for the first time in a decade because of conference realignment. And now you move to this season, and it's Virginia and Maryland playing again for the first time in a decade because of conference realignment. Granted, this was, Maryland's doing on their side, leaving the ACC starting in 2014. And so the last time these schools played was in 2013. And kind of like Greg with the backyard brawl in Pitt and West Virginia, you've got to do a little bit of, I'll call it re-education of what the rivalry meant to people. I asked Maryland coach Mike Loxley this week. I was like, hey, it's a big game, and everybody, folks our age, folks older than us, friends of mine that I've talked to who live on both sides of the Potomac, are excited for the game. But you've got a lot of players, and when we talk to the players, they were in middle school when the last time these teams played, and they come from all over the country and maybe don't, have any kind of history of that. And so in Maryland, Loxley said he's going to talk to the kids about what this meant to the program, what this means to this fan base. And it's obviously Virginia has older rivals, North Carolina, of course, the oldest rivalry in the South, as it's called. For Maryland, though, this is not their oldest rival, but it's the one they played the most. Friday's game will be 79th time Maryland and Virginia have played. That's the most for the Terps. And so Maryland's giving it the treatment. It's going to be a blackout game. They're bringing out the black uniforms and script Terps on a black helmet for the first time. So Maryland is doing their best to kind of reignite the fire here a little bit for these old ACC rivals. I'm curious to how in Charlottesville, the view from that side on playing this game for the first time in a decade for the Who's.
Yeah, I think at the most basic level, players are pretty excited from the few I talked to this week about it, because there's a lot of intermingling of guys who played against each other in high school or knows somebody that went to high school with somebody on the other side. It's fascinating, and Virginia, they'll be educated about it too this week. They've got a few assistants who formerly played for both sides of the rivalry. Actually, Jerome Cox, their defensive backs coach, was a standout at Maryland, standout defensive back for the Terrapins. And then UVA has a couple assistants, Chris Slade and Clint Sinham, who played on the Virginia side of the rivalry. So there's some feel for it, even if the players haven't seen it in over a decade and wouldn't know as much about it. And then even Jameer Carter, Virginia's standout defensive tackle, he's from Baltimore. His dad worked in Maryland's strength and conditioning department when Vernon Davis and Sean Merriman were there. And Carter was telling me, he kind of grew up around those guys, grew up watching those guys, and it fueled his work ethic. Wasn't recruited until late by Maryland, had already decided on Virginia at Archbishop Spalding High School. So it's fascinating. You have those kind of stories, that kind of feel, right, George, where even though the game hasn't been played there's an understanding of what it means because it was an every year event in the past, and you have families that are connected and coaches that are connected and understand it. Loxley knows too firsthand.
Yeah.
So I think there's ways to make players have a better grip and a better grasp of it.
And Loxley, an assistant on the Maryland staff the last time the teams played, 2013. Virginia leading that game late into the fourth quarter. Maryland came back, scored a touchdown, won by a point, 27-26, way back in 2013. Now in 2023, Loxley and his program poised, hoping, primed for what they hope is an eye-opening season for a lot of people. They're 2-0. They've stated their goal of they believe they're here to contend for a Big Ten championship. They haven't necessarily played like that yet, but hope to kind of work their way into it. On the Virginia side of the coin, struggling a little bit out of the gate here. 0-2 are the Who's with a loss last week, down up 11 points to James Madison at home, and falling in a late comeback there. But it's hard to ignore the circumstances, Greg, surrounding the program after the tragedy last year where Lavelle Davis, Deshaun Perry, Devin Chandler were killed as part of a bus trip coming back from Washington, D.C., killed in a shooting on the way back from that trip. And the program has kind of really had to just refocus and just reconfigure a lot of things in the aftermath of that tragedy. And so it was a very emotional day at Scott Stadium on Saturday, playing the first home game since that happened. If you can give a sense for people, people who've read about it, for a lot of us far away, it's a headline in the news and it's tragic, and it's a city and a community that going back to, years before has dealt, unfortunately, with gun violence and tragedies like this, the Charlottesville and Central Virginia community. If you can kind of give a sense of just how the program and the community is managing this going forward now at the start of a new football season.
Yeah, it's been difficult for the football program, and that's probably the understatement of the century because ever since last November, November 13th, 2022, when that tragedy occurred, there's been different checkpoints along the way for the football program. It was in the spring getting back on the football field for spring practice, and then there was the spring football game. And then it was the season opener a couple of weeks ago against Tennessee down in Nashville. And of course, this past Saturday was kind of the culmination of the last one of those big events, right? Of the healing process. And Tony Elliott always likes to say, it's not moving on, it's moving forward. And there are things that the program has done to honor those three that were lost, Lavelle, Devin, and Deshaun. All three just outstanding young men. It interviewed all three of them during my time on the beat, and it's just a horrible, senseless tragedy. But the program, they unveiled their uniform numbers up on the Scott Stadium, up on an awning at Scott Stadium. So those numbers will sit there as long as Scott Stadium does. There was a great ceremony pregame this past Saturday in which they had paratroopers fly in with the number of each player. Lavelle's number 1, Devin's number 15, and Deshaun's number 41. On flags before the game onto the field. And they had a video which was narrated by Samuel L. Jackson that was pretty powerful pregame. So they've done a lot. And that was just this past Saturday. They've got legacy patches on those jersey numbers that are still being worn. There are players in the program that had relationships or had worn a number previously that were allowed to wear those numbers still. Like Will Bettridge, the kicker, was a high school teammate of Deshaun Perry. He switched from number 17 to number 41 to honor Deshaun. Sedarian Harrison, a freshman wide receiver, played in the same high school program as Lavelle Davis Jr. down in South Carolina. He's wearing number 1 like Davis did. Chico Bennett Jr. Had worn 15 previously. He's still in that number, but those numbers now all have a patch associated with it that has Lavelle Davis's name, Deshaun Perry's name, and Devin Chandler's name on them on those specific jerseys. There's helmet decals. There's a lot the program is doing. The community has rallied too. They've really been supportive for the football program. Scott Stadium had over 50,000 in attendance last week for the James Madison game, the home opener. Some of those from the other side of the mountain in purple to root on their Dukes. But even still, even the JMU fans were great. I saw some purple wearing folks with orange pins and
Mm.
buttons to help honor Devin Lavelle and Deshaun. And it's really been their motivation. And you don't have to look any further than the running back, Mike Hollins, the surviving victim, one of the surviving victims of that shooting. Doctors told him, and when he was in the hospital, he said that it would be 3 to 4 months before he'd even be able to put his socks on.
Mm.
He was back on the football field in that time,
Mm.
practicing during the spring, and he scored 2 touchdowns in the home opener this past weekend. So there's a lot going on. He's their captain, their inspirational leader. He's their guy, and if just because things aren't going well for them, 0-2 doesn't mean they've given up on the season because they understand, you know, they had it taken from them last year. The last 2 games canceled in the aftermath of that tragedy, George.
Hmm. And to your point, Greg, there are plenty of bright spots here to look at, even amidst, whatever the record is. Hollins himself had 2 touchdowns in Saturday's game against the Dukes. And then you've got Anthony Calandria, who comes in because Tony Muskett was Virginia's quarterback, got injured in week 1, and Belanger comes out 370, 20 to 20 to 20. These are Talia Tagovailoa numbers, 20 to 26, 377 yards and 2 touchdowns. I'm very familiar seeing those type of numbers on my stat lines when covering the Terps. Good enough to earn him ACC Rookie of the Week honors. I saw that Tony Elliott said, that Muskett, of course, isn't going to lose his job because of it, but now presents a little bit of an interesting quandary for Virginia, where you can start one, utilize the other, different formations or setups. Maryland, for their to their credit, went and brought in Billy Edwards, who's a Lake Braddock, Virginia kid, and performed well when Tagovailoa was injured last year. They brought him in run packages to get first downs, and he scored a rushing, 1 yard rushing touchdown, bush push type of style of a play. And so Virginia maybe even has something more dynamic than that, where both of both Calandria and Muskett can sling the ball around. I'm curious to your thoughts on how you think that distribution is going to go Friday night against Maryland. And is it going to be a 50-50 thing? How fully back is Muskett, or are we going to see Calandria being the main guy again, just maybe out of a sense of caution for what Tony did?
So the sense is that Muskett will play as long as he's good to go. He'll be the starter, and it's his job to lose basically at this point. Even though after watching Saturday, it's hard to argue
Mm.
that Calandria gives him something a little bit different, especially with Virginia's offensive line, right? It's a little bit of a work in progress for the Who's up front. They have some transfers in: Jimmy Chris from Penn State, you got Anana from Houston, Brian Stevens from Dayton at the FCS level, along with some younger returning players like Mikhail Boley, Noah Josie. The O line is a work in progress. They've given up 8 sacks in the first 2 weeks. It's been a tough start for that group. Their new O line coach too, and Terry Heffernan in from Stanford. And while it seems like it's a better match than the previous O line coach Garrett Touche, because of Heffernan's background, more pro style, more wanting to do and capable of doing exactly what Tony Elliott and the offensive coordinator Des Kitchings want to do with their more pro style offense. It seems like it's going to take some time.
Hmm.
So with Calandri, where I'm going with this is his mobility enables them to mask some of their problems up front, right? You look at the big plays Virginia had on Saturday, 63-yard touchdown to Malik Washington from Calandria, a 75-yard touchdown catch by Kobe Pace, the running back, and a 68-yard catch from Parrish Jones, the running back that helped set up another touchdown. Those 3 passing plays of 60 yards or more were more than the 2 Virginia had all of last year.
Hmm.
And it's because, in part, because of Calandria's mobility. He extended the play on the throw to Pace. He extended the play on the throw to Jones, and he just has a little bit of that wiggle that coaches say Muskett has, but hasn't been shown in a game yet. Muskett had a very tough task week 1 against Tennessee. That defense was flying around, and it took a little while for Virginia's O line to figure it out. So they want to see, I think, what Musket can do against somebody other than Tennessee. And I think that's totally fair, right? You bring in a veteran player from Monmouth, and he was very accomplished there with the Hawks in New Jersey. 51 touchdowns to 16 interceptions over 3 seasons there. Graduate level player. So you want to give him the benefit of the doubt. And I think, too, right? It'd be very difficult to go to Calandria if Musket is ready and then things not work out with Calandria and then go back to Musket. I think if you go to Musket now and say in a week or two it's not working, then you could go to Calandria and you have a reason. You don't just take somebody out of the role because they got hurt
Mhm.
and didn't show it in a tough week. So I think they want to see if Musket can do it. Uh, and then if it doesn't, then you can always go to the freshman. But I don't think you can go the other way where
One
you
starts.
go
Mhm.
back to Musket, right? I think that would cause a little confusion in the locker room.
Yeah. And Virginia starts out with, two power in their non-conference, obviously, as you mentioned, Tennessee and now
Yeah.
Maryland. It's an unfortunate way to have to start.
It's a brutal schedule. Even the James Madison, right? I
Hmm.
mean, that program, I covered that program for a long time for the Harrisonburg paper, 5 years. And that program knows how to win football games.
Solid
And
team. Hmm.
and they have talent. They have Power Five transfers in their roster. And Kirk Signetti, the coach there, has done a really good job keeping that program on the ascent. Since Mickey Matthews, Everett Withers, and Mike Houston. Mike Houston led them to their second national championship, and that program's gone up. So the non-conference schedule has just been a brutal way to start for a Virginia program trying to find its footing under Elliott in his second year.
Yeah, it's like, hey, congratulations, no more divisions this year in the ACC, but here's your bad non-conference. So,
Correct. Yeah, they avoid Florida State and
mhm,
Clemson in the league, but the non-conference schedule certainly makes up for
yeah, Maryland still having to deal with that gauntlet: Ohio State, Penn State, and Michigan one more time. So again, bright spots for the Who's to have to look forward to there. It's a short week, obviously, for both teams. Friday night, FS1, 7 o'clock. It's going to be a nice, beautiful night based on the forecast. Maryland looking to kind of find a get right because they looked not slug. They handled Towson the way they were supposed to. There's not too much you can read from that game. They play Charlotte and a roster that had Biff Poggi, who was a long time grew up in Baltimore. He coached St. Francis and Gilman, very powerful high schools there. Took Mike Miller, who was Maryland's co-offensive coordinator, with him, and so they get out to a 14-0 lead. Terps eventually claw back, and the score was not indicative of how the first half went in that game. And Michael Locksley wasn't happy about it. But now coming back, rivalry before Maryland goes into the Big Ten and Virginia gets into their ACC schedule. Maryland are favored in this game. Virginia beats Maryland if blank. What if the Who's were to pull the upset? How does it have to go down for Virginia?
I think first and foremost they got to stop the run on defense, and it's been surprising given how that the Virginia's defense was the strength of the program last year. They gave up only 24 points per game last year. First 2 weeks of the season, they've been gashed on the ground. No, I think only one Power Five team has given up more rushing yards than Virginia, and surprisingly, that's Colorado, and they're 2 and
Wow.
0.
Yeah. Hmm.
So Virginia has, and they've got their entire starting defensive line back. The two end players, Chico Bennett Jr. And Cam Butler. Bennett missed the first week with an injury, but he was back last week for in a limited role. He'll be back full go this week is the expectation. Jameer Carter, the defensive tackle, who I mentioned earlier, Baltimore native, is an outstanding player on the interior. And same with Aaron Famui, who's a sixth-year guy. So they got to get more production from that D line, especially when it comes to stopping the run, because against Tennessee, it was bad. I think it was 287 rushing yards on the ground, 5 rushing touchdowns given up, 2 rushing touchdowns to James Madison this past Saturday, including a final 12 minutes or whatever that they just got absolutely bruised and battered on the ground. That can't happen. Right? Maryland's too
Hmm.
good on offense to let them bully you up front. So that to me is kind of fascinating, and what they do from here is going to be kind of indicative of how they're going to play this season, right? They've got to get better because you can't stop the run. You
Yeah.
can't stop anybody on defense. So that's first and foremost. And I know Maryland's loaded with Roman Emby,
Roman
right?
Hemby, 217 all-purpose last week, which was a career high. Yeah.
Yeah, he's an excellent freshman All American last year. The whole bit, and they know it too. They know Virginia knows that they can't have some of the tackling problems they've had the first 2 weeks. It starts with stopping the run. I think that's the first piece of it, and then on offense, Virginia looked as good last week as it has in Tony Elliott's tenure on
Mhm.
offense. So if they can keep some of those big plays going, I think it gives them a shot because against Maryland, you're probably going to have to score. You're probably going to have to score at least into the 20s to have a chance. And that's something this Virginia team you couldn't say, week in and week out they could do last year. If they can get into the 20s, maybe they got a shot at pulling an upset, assuming their run defense can get right.
Greg Medea with the Charlottesville Daily Progress covers the Virginia Cavaliers. Greg, let folks know where they can find your coverage on socials and at the paper there.
Yeah, you can find it at dailyprogress.com and then on Twitter/X at Greg Medea.
Awesome. Once again, Greg, appreciate it as always, and I'll see you Friday.
Yeah, George, looking forward to seeing you Friday. It will be nice to catch up.
Absolutely. My thanks to Greg for joining me. You can follow his work covering the Cavaliers all season long at Greg Medea on social media and at the Daily Progress in Charlottesville. Maryland leads the all-time series 44-32-2 and has won 3 of the last 4 games. Kickoff is set for 7 o'clock p.m. on FS1. A reminder that you can find the District of Sports wherever you get your podcasts. Just search District of Sports in your favorite podcast app, and to follow my coverage at Gerbo3 on social media, as well as at WashingtonTimes.com/sports, where you can find coverage of the Maryland Terrapins, the Commanders, Capitals, and more. That's at Wash Times Sports on social media and WashingtonTimes.com/sports. I'm George Gerbo. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.